Hi everyone, welcome back to Lifting the Lamp. I'm Frata Eleftheria, and in this video I'm going to do a deep dive into the issue of Enochian magic, a bit of an origin story on Enochian magic, if you will. The story of how this angelic system of magic came into being with John Dee and Edward Kelly is an interesting enough story in its own right, but actually that story of the Enochian communications in Elizabethan times is just a snapshot of a much bigger and older and deeper story, which spans hundreds, even thousands of years, and that is the story of angelic contact with humanity and the different methods that have been used to do that over the years and the centuries. And so what tonight is all about really is to demonstrate that what began in Elizabethan England is actually something which has its origins much further back. Although we talk about Enochian magic as something that was revealed to John Dee and Edward Kelly, in actual fact it's a bit more complicated than that, because the techniques for calling upon angels, the spiritual technology that was used by Dee and Kelly and developed through the angelic communications, was inspired by much older versions of the same thing. And so you can think of it kind of like a band with influences. Think of a really great band like Led Zeppelin. Songs like Stairway to Heaven are definitely inspired works, and yet the style of the band, the genre, is undoubtedly influenced by earlier forms of music, such as in the case of Led Zeppelin, blues instead of rock and roll. So we can see how even inspired knowledge can have worldly influences on how it is brought about. And it's the same with Enochian magic. In fact, the system of what we know today as Enochian magic was never really intended as a completely new or original form of magic. The angels told Dee and Kelly that this was a perfection of earlier forms of magic. It was a true, more perfect version of the Kabbalah. It was a pathway to more true and perfect forms of knowledge that went before but were lost, and a restoration of that. And so this is the story of the knowledge that went before, that laid the foundation, laid the groundwork for the Enochian experiments of Dee and Kelly to come into being. So I've prepared this nifty chart here. Let's see what my Tylenol brain has been cooking up this week. As you can see, there's a lot of information here. And indeed, there were a lot of influences on particularly John Dee. He was very knowledgeable. His occult library was one of the biggest in Europe at the time. So lots of different influences. And if I were to go through all of them, this would be a very long video. So what I'm going to focus in on, rather than looking at Dee's philosophy or cosmological theories or anything like that, I'm going to focus in on angelic magic, so the techniques that he used and the entities he believed he was communicating with. I'm going to focus in on the origins of those two things in particular. Okay, so a good place to start is thinking about instructions on creating the tools that the Enochian angels gave during the Heptarchia communications. These are your bread and butter basic Enochian magical tools. You've got the Sigillum Dei Aemeth, of course, Ring of Solomon, the lamen, the holy table, and various talismans. In particular, the ensigns of creation are a pretty important one in most, if not all, Enochian magical workings. So let's take these together first. As we trace each of them back, we'll see that they in fact have a common origin. To start with the Sigillum Dei Aemeth, I've spoken about this in a video before, my video on the 144,000. This sigillum had names and things like that added to it by John Dee as a result of the angelic communications, but the design itself and the concept comes from an older grimoire known as Liber Juratus, which was quite an influence on John Dee. So that's probably the most recognizable tool in Enochian magic. The wax seal that the crystal ball sits on. That's one of the things that you need. What else do you need? Well, the wax seal sits on top of a holy table with a specific design on it. So let's look at that next. The holy table. This is something which, again, appears to have been influenced by earlier forms of magic. And specifically, there is a part of the Lesser Key of Solomon, known as the Ars Almodel, which has a very similar design in it, for a divination tool called an almodel that you use for divination purposes and communicating with angels. So, presumably a direct influence on Dee's holy table. And, you know, most people know the Lesser Key of Solomon because they know the Goetia. The Goetia is one of 5 parts of the Lesser Key of Solomon. And there's 4 other books in there which I think are thoroughly underrated. So instead of calling up demons and ruining your life, if you want to work with the Lesser Key of Solomon, check out some of those texts. Other essential tools that you need in an Enochian ritual are a lamen that you wear around your neck and a holy ring that you use for commanding spirits. So let's trace those. The ring, which is called the Ring of Solomon by the angels, is a pre-existing idea in medieval grimoires by this point. Again, if we look to the Lesser Key of Solomon, the same source of inspiration for the Holy Table, we see a design for a Ring of Solomon that was used to command, in that instance, demons in order to fulfill the magical purposes of the magician, and it's attributed to King Solomon, hence the name. And really we see a variation of this in Enochian magic. And finally, the lamen, again, something which doesn't seem as directly influenced by something like the Lesser Key of Solomon. But then if you look at the design for the original lamen that was communicated by the angels, it looks very much like something from a grimoire, like the Lesser Key of Solomon. So again, a likely influence there. 3 of the 4 tools seem to come from the Greater or Lesser Key of Solomon as a source of inspiration, at least, with the Sigillum Dei Aemeth coming from Liber Juratus. And all of these texts are considered in the same genre, if you will, of magical books, namely Solomonic books, Solomonic magic. And I've done a video on this type of magic before. I'll link it in the description below if you're interested. But Solomonic magic really can be traced back to texts such as the Magical Treatise of Solomon and Sefer Raziel, which inspired later texts like the ones mentioned here. But really what it can be considered as is a branch of the Kabbalah, the so-called practical Kabbalah, whereas other forms of Kabbalah are concerned with contemplating God and ascending to God and all of that. The practical Kabbalah is very much about getting things using magic, which is what these books are largely about. But here, what we have is using that same type of spiritual technology for the express purpose of communicating with angels. And that was indeed one of the uses that this spiritual technology of Solomonic magic could be used for, even within the source texts. We see the genre of Solomonic magic having an influence on the Enochian system in other areas as well. Certain of the designs for the ensigns of creation and some of the talismans of the Heptarchia seem to be reminiscent of Solomonic talismans, such as those that appear in the Ars Paulina, for example, have similar design features to the Heptarchia talismans. And you could say that the tables of different letters is very similar to what we see in some versions of this genre as well, such as we see with the ensigns of creation. And you can compare it to some of the table-looking talismanic figures in something like Sefer Raziel, for example. Staying with Solomonic magic for a moment, there's another big influence on another part of Enochian magic from this style of magic, which is the tables of log are. So one of the most important bits of information that Dee and Kelly received in the Enochian system was these tables of logger, which would be used to complete the Jebethal ritual. There's a bit of a story behind their importance, which I'll get into a little bit later in this video. But in terms of the type of magical technology it was, these tables with various letters in them and encrypted information is very similar to an earlier book of magic that Dee was obsessed with, known as the Book of Soyga. And this again was most likely influenced by forms of practical Kabbalah that were popular at the time, such as we see expressed in the Solomonic magical tradition. Kabbalah was the influence upon other parts of Enochian magic as well. So the Jebethal ritual, for example, this is a major ritual which involves the tables of logger, a very important part of the Enochian magical system. And this seems to be based on an earlier ritual known as the counting of the Omer. Aaron Leach has done some great scholarship on this. The counting of the Omer actually goes all the way back to the Torah, but when Kabbalah came on the scene, it kind of reinterpreted the counting of the Omer and saw the 49 days of the ritual as encompassing the lower 7 Sephirot of the Tree of Life, with 7 times 7 giving a sacred number of the days of that ritual. It's very much about raising the spirit up gradually through to higher and higher levels of consciousness, closer and closer to God, and receiving revelation at the end of this process. So very similar to what the Jebethal ritual was supposed to accomplish as well. And all of this goes back to a merkavah mysticism. This form of Jewish mysticism got its name from the merkavah or chariot of God that appears in the book of Ezekiel. And really, Ezekiel was the inspiration for this form of magic, the way that he could glimpse the throne of God, that he could travel in the spirit vision to get close to the throne of God and the very highest angels, and to communicate with them. And that's what merkavah mysticism was really trying to recreate by those who practiced it. And this really was arguably the biggest influence on later Kabbalah. There was quite a lot of kind of interaction between merkavah mysticism and the genre of occult literature known as the Hekkelot literature, which is all about ascending into heaven. The most famous examples of such literature are the 3 books of Enoch, which give an account of the prophet Enoch's own ascent into heaven to speak to the angels and gain knowledge. It probably also influenced St. Paul, who refers to traveling to the 3rd heaven. It's probably an example of him practicing this style of mysticism. And it gets quite intriguing around the 1st century AD, 1st, 2nd century BC. There's a lot going on in Judea. So you've got the Qumran community who had access to the Book of Enoch. You've got the emergence of Christianity, which may or may not have been influenced by the Qumran community. Appears to have been influenced by merkavah mysticism at certain points, at the very least through St. Paul. You've got the emergence of Gnosticism from all of this. A lot of really interesting stuff going on involving talking to angels, ascending to heaven in the spirit, and all this sort of thing, all of which would later influence the big sort of central piece of Enochian magic, which is all about doing exactly the same thing, rising through the ethers, or projecting the consciousness to the parts of the earth, or communicating with angels to gain various forms of knowledge, scrying, in other words. So the same way that the Gnostic sought to ascend up through the various aeons to return to God, the Enochian magical system sought to do, but described aethers instead of aeons. But it's pretty much the same process, except instead of trying to escape a prison reality, it's more about, discovering the secrets of God's creation. The last kind of technical aspect of the Enochian magical system that I'd like to mention is the Enochian language itself, which was never called Enochian. It was actually described as the Adamic language by John Dee, Edward Kelly. It was an attempt to rediscover something called the Adamic language, which supposedly existed before the flood and was spoken by all of humanity and was this sacred language that Adam used to give words to everything. So it was the ultimate, most magically powerful language, more powerful even than Hebrew. And the Enochian alphabet, the Enochian language, was an attempt to recreate that. But this idea of the Adamic language actually comes from Jewish mysticism, as does all of this other stuff. But there is also some Greek influence, quite a lot of Greek influence, particularly through Hermeticism and Neoplatonism via Agrippa in some cases. And through this whole process, there was Hellenization at various points influencing the development of all this stuff. But really, for our purposes, the influence of the Greek and Babylonian and stuff tended to be more about how the cosmos was divided up into 7 parts for the 7 heavenly bodies and things of that nature, rather than the techniques that would be used to communicate with these angelic entities. It's not to say that something like Hermeticism didn't have techniques like that, but it does seem that the techniques that informed Enochian magic seem to be more Jewish, and they seem to be more Kabbalistic than anything else. And similarly, the specific beings that were being called upon by Enochian magic were not like the Greek gods or the Egyptian gods or anything like that. It was a thoroughly Christian cosmos. It was the names of angels that were being called upon. They answered to God. The various names of the Sigillum Dei Aemeth were names of God. And even the 7-fold division, which seems more kind of Greek, actually can be seen as something that comes from earlier Jewish sources, which divided the universe into rulership by 7 archangels. This is a concept that appears in the Book of Enoch in particular, and seems to have been picked up by Agrippa and others. And the names of some of the angels in the Sigillum Dei Aemeth are identical to these very much Jewish and Christian angels that appear in the works of people like Agrippa. The classic Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, etc. So I've done a lot to establish where the spiritual and magical techniques that fed into Enochian magic came from, where the entities that were being called upon by this form of magic were borrowed from, and which systems before Enochian magic were trying to commune with these beings. Another thing I want to cover in this video is some of the themes that emerge in Enochian magic and where those come from. A lot of the core concepts of Enochian magic that interacted with this technology come from the books of Enoch and the Book of Revelation. The tables of Logger were really seen as an attempt to receive the lost Book of Enoch, written in heaven, and contained all of the knowledge that Enoch learnt from the angels, to draw that down to the earth again. And so this comes from the books of Enoch. The seal of the true and living God, otherwise known as the seal of the living God, comes directly from the Book of Revelation. And my video on the 144,000 discusses that in more detail. The Jebaphel ritual, which is supposed to be one of the heralds of the end times, is actually just another form of the opening of the scroll in heaven that we see in the Book of Revelation. Because the scroll that the Lamb opens in heaven is one and the same with the Book of Life, which is one and the same with the Book of Enoch. And of course, the tables of Logger are the Book of Enoch. And the Jebaphel ritual is the opening of the mysteries of that book. And so you can see in a way that the Jebaphel ritual represents the opening of the 7 seals. Another part of the Enochian magical system, that of the tables of the Watchtowers, which are actually quite similar to other tables and things like that in the Enochian system. But in terms of the information they communicate, we see a very strong connection with, in particular, the Book of Revelation. So the Great Table of the Watchtowers contains 4 tables for each of the 4 elements, and within each individual table there's 6 angelic beings' names embedded in there who are called the 6 seniors. There's 6 seniors for each table for a total of 24, and these are the 24 elders that appear before the throne in the book of Revelation. And in some of the visions that Dee and Kelly recorded or received, we see the Watchtowers and some of the words and names associated with the Watchtowers appearing in a vision of a heavenly city with 4 different sides to it, and 12 to each of the tribes of Israel, corresponding to the 12 signs of the zodiac. And this is an image of the New Jerusalem, another symbol that appears in the book of Revelation, as represented here. So what we have is a long-standing tradition going back hundreds or even thousands of years of communication with angels, which really started in Old Testament times with the prophets and other wise people and patriarchs who are communicating with God. And then that develops during the Second Temple period into more mystical movements like the Qumran community, some of the communities that were around in Jesus' time, the Gnostics, the merkavah mystics, all of these interesting kind of characters that were around in this time. Early Christianity, perhaps more of the mystical forms of Christianity. On the Jewish side, we see it developing into the Holy Kabbalah, where there's still mystics who are practicing this stuff, trying to communicate with angels and enter mystical experiences to get closer to God. This develops into various forms of magic, such as Solomonic magic. All of these magical occult techniques for remote viewing the heavens, basically, and entering into communication with angelic entities. And the story continues with the reception of the Enochian magical system by John Dee and Edward Kelly. But it is just that, it is a continuation of a much older story. I could very well add another part to this diagram up here, which is describing how Enochian magic led to many of the techniques that are used by top secret government programs to try and contact the entities behind UAP. But that is a topic for another time. That's too deep for this video. But what I do want to demonstrate and comment on here is that some of the ideas that have been emerging in the last months of disclosure of human contact with beings from other realms, whether that's another planet or another dimension or what have you, it is a very old idea. There's always been groups that have held the secret to doing this stuff, which has been coveted by many people who want to know the truth of the mysteries of our world. And human-initiated contact, popularized by Dr. Stephen Greer in the C5 protocols, is not a new idea either. We've got a whole history here of techniques and technologies for human-initiated contact with beings from somewhere outside of this planet, in this case, angelic beings. The other thing I'd like to impress on people as well is this isn't just some fringe thing. This isn't just something that was lurking in the shadows that nobody important knew about. There were some very influential people that were involved in all of this. John Dee was a hugely influential figure in his own day. Some of the people that were involved in this stuff were also very influential. There was Trimethius, who would go on to be a mentor to not only Agrippa, but also to Paracelsus, who was one of the pioneers of modern medicine. Trimethius was a polymath in his own right. He contributed a lot to cryptography and stenography as well. In the mystical Jewish world, you've got a lot of influential rabbis that were probably involved in creating this stuff. Sefer Raziel was probably written by Eliezer of Worms, a very influential rabbi. So this is something that is important to human history. And in order to fully understand human history, we need to understand this side of it as well. the secret history of angelic contact. And that's the history that I've tried to outline to you tonight. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like, subscribe to this channel to support my work, hit the notification bell when you subscribe, so YouTube will actually tell you when I publish new videos. And if you want to give me even more support, hit join or thanks down below. But thank you again for listening, and I'll see you next time.